Thank you, Boz. I would now like to invite the U.S. Ambassador to Israel, His Excellency Ambassador Mike Huckabee, to the stage. It is our honor to have you with us. Ambassador Huckabee is the former governor of Arkansas, devoted and true friend of the State of Israel, and God bless you for your support of our country. We do not take it for granted. We've had many ambassadors here, very few like you.
Thank you very much. It is an extraordinary honor for me to be able to be here, first of all, at this incredible university. Just hearing the background and success of it is inspiring. It's a university like no other, not only in Israel, but like no other in the world. And I want to say, Dr. Reichman, thank you. Not just for having me here, although I'm grateful for that, but more importantly, thank you for having the vision of a university that does not get its instructions from the government, but gets its instructions from what is needed in a culture and in a society. And I hope that every student who is a part of this campus appreciates the uniqueness and appreciates the vision and the forward thinking of creating a university that is focused upon the students and their future and not simply the perpetuation of the institution itself, as is the case with so many educational institutions. As Boaz was speaking about where we were on 9/11, I think it's true that any above the age of 5 will probably remember very vividly where one was on that day. I was serving at the time as governor of Arkansas. I was attending a meeting of the Southern Governors Association in Lexington, Kentucky. I just finished a breakfast meeting. I'd gone back to my hotel room to gather some things for the next round of meetings, as these things tend to be. As I walked into my room, the phone rang. It was the state police detail who was with me. They said, "Turn on the television. Something very strange is happening in New York." I turned on the television, and the first plane had hit the tower. And at that moment, nobody could really figure out what was happening. Was this an accident? Was it a small airplane that had veered off course? But the impact appeared to be much more severe than a small airplane could have created. And why would a larger plane, an airline, with all of the sophistication that it has of navigation, errantly flown into a building the size of the North Tower of the World Trade Center? And as anchors on television were trying to get reporters to the scene and have some understanding of what was happening, as I was watching live, as many of you perhaps were as well, the second plane hit the South Tower. And at that moment, the world knew this is no accident on a day in which the sky was blue and clear. This was intentional. These were acts of terror. And over the next few hours, as another airplane flew into the Pentagon, and as United Flight 93 was commandeered by passengers who knew they were taking their own lives by preventing that plane from flying into the U.S. Capitol or perhaps the White House, the world came to a stop, a dead stop. And certainly we in the United States realized our lives would never quite be the same. We thought terrorism was something that happened to you here in Israel. We assumed that it was the kind of thing that we might see little flickers of it, maybe occasionally somebody instigating an attack on an individual or a small group. But it never occurred to the United States that we would be the target of something so vile, so vicious, and so overwhelming to institutions that we thought were absolutely impenetrable. We were wrong. And it was a shock, but it was a wake-up call. And it caused the United States to change almost everything we did. I've often said that from that day forward, my own job as a governor of a state far removed from the nation's capital, it changed, and it was never the same again. I went from primarily focusing on things like our education system and economic development and building of roads and the maintaining of all of the services of state government, which include things like making sure people had driver's licenses and that there was water flowing to cities, to now being concerned with whether or not somebody would commandeer even something as simple as a crop dusting plane, fill it with fuel, and fly it into the state capitol. We suddenly became immersed in a culture that we were really not prepared for, a culture that made us all, as governors across all 50 states, end up getting top secret security clearances so that we could be brought in on the joint terrorism task forces that were being set up all across the country that involved federal agencies like the FBI and the intelligence agencies, as well as our local police agencies. It transformed our focus. And we were spending time doing things that, quite frankly, when we campaigned for the office, we never imagined that it would include something like counterterrorism. A lot of what we had to learn it from the Israelis, because your entire existence as a nation has been fighting counterterrorism. And I could say back to 1948, but it would be more appropriate to say you've been fighting terrorism for 4,000 years. It's not something new. The desire to annihilate the Jewish people is as old as Abraham, and it's as recent as yesterday. Today, as I come here to speak with you, I do so with a deep understanding that there is a desperate need in our world to recognize what you are up against, because it's what we in the United States are up against. Your enemies are our enemies. And unfortunately, there's some people in America who don't seem to fully understand that. The same people who attacked us on 9/11, that same ideology, that same level of vitriol and hatred is exactly what you face every single day in trying to protect your very existence as a nation and as a Jewish people. And it's why when the 12-day war with Iran was so significant, I got to tell you, I was incredibly grateful to President Trump for recognizing that it wasn't just Israel's war, that Iran having a nuclear weapon was a threat not just to the state of Israel. Because for 46 years, Iran has said, death to Israel, and then in the same breath said, and death to America. I was around in 1979. I'm sure you can look at me and tell, yep, you certainly were. And I remember when the Ayatollahs took over, and I remember very vividly what they said then, what they never stopped saying since then, and that is their ultimate goal was not just to take on the little Satan, Israel, but to take on the great Satan, the United States. It was always clear to me that their target was ultimately all of Western civilization. It wasn't because that we had a form of government that they didn't like. It wasn't just because we had an economic engine that they didn't like. It wasn't because we had an educational system that they detested. It was because we had a value system in which we valued the individual. We believed in a moral code that some things are always right and some things are always wrong. And it's because we had the common heritage in Western civilization of believing that ultimately we're not just accountable to the government, we are accountable to the God who gave the even right to have a government. And that the government's job was not to be God, it was to make sure that we were the agents so that God's law, God's way could be implemented in a society where people treated each other with respect and with dignity. The ideology that sought to destroy the United States and Israel is an ideology that hates the idea that people would be free to think for themselves, free to act in their own interest rather than in the interest and at the total subservience of a government of totalitarianism. A lot of Americans for the first time understood on September 11th of 2001 that we were facing something very different. This was unlike a war we've ever been in, because it was not a war with another country that declared war on us and wished for our land, wished for our economic resources. This was an ideology that wished to destroy our way of life, our thinking, our underpinning as a free people. Sadly, over the years, a lot of people in our country either never understood it or they've forgotten. And it's very important that a conference like this is not just designed to help the specialists or the experts or those who are directly involved in counterterrorism understand the threats. It's even more important that that message goes beyond the borders of this room and gets to the general population, both in Israel and the United States, and that people understand that the threat that we faced on 9/11, that you experienced on October the 7th, is not a threat that is getting smaller by the day, it is getting larger by the day. It outrages me that across this planet we have people that are blaming Israel for what's going on in Gaza right now. What's going on in Gaza is the direct result of the terrorist acts of Hamas, who on October the 7th carried out the most unspeakable things, not against a standing army, not even against a country, but against civilians who woke up that morning thinking it was a holiday and finding out that there were people that they had tried to be nice to who now were coming to murder them in the most atrocious manner. Not just to kill them, but to massacre them, to mutilate them, to humiliate them. It was the worst kind of terrorism because it was designed to inflict the highest level of pain, not just physical, but emotional and even spiritual, upon the victims, and to send the message of savagery. A savagery that could not be responded to with mere diplomacy and sitting down and having a talk, because these are not people who understand such things as having a conversation. One must have a basis of some level of morality in order to have such a negotiation or conversation. Hamas is capable of neither. And it's why yesterday, when I was participating in a Zoom event with a major university in the United States, the audience were the CEOs of the top 50 corporations in the U.S. If I named the corporations, they would be the ones you would all understand and know. And while I was in that conversation on the Zoom call, I will tell you that there was an audience given to one of the people who was attending. He is a former diplomat, and they asked him about his view of what was happening in Gaza. And he immediately began to do what we hear from the Europeans and what we're hearing across the globe. He was criticizing Israel, that Israel ought to just call a halt to it. Israel ought to just stop it. Israel ought to just say, we won, and say that's it. And he droned on for several minutes, and I sat there and listened to him. If I told you his name, you would know it, because he's well known in this part of the world. He's an American diplomat. And it made me realize that I don't want to be that kind of diplomat. If that's diplomacy, I want no part of it. Because diplomacy that is nothing more than babble and vanilla-coated nonsense that somehow believes that everybody's just on the same side and that we have slight variations of opinion, that's what's going to get us killed. We must understand that there is a difference between light and darkness, between good and evil. There is a difference between up and down. Our battle is not a horizontal one, the left versus the right. This is a vertical battle between the forces of heaven and the forces of hell. And if we don't understand that, we are only going to see more terrorism that will kill more innocent people across this planet. And so when he finished and he had completed his essentially blaming Israel for the prolonged war in Gaza, they finally turned to me and said, would I like to respond? And I was thinking, boy, would I. And I just mentioned the fact that Israel didn't start the war, but they were attacked, and attacked viciously, brutally, and without cause. And that they had no choice, not just to fight back, but to end Hamas' occupation of Gaza. That to do anything less than that would be as ridiculous and as irrational as it would have been to leave the Nazis in power in Germany after World War II, which nobody would have thought to be a good idea. I mentioned the fact that the Europeans, the French, the Brits, the Dutch, and even non-Europeans like the Canadians have taken a direction that makes no sense. It's a direction that says Israel needs to end this. And I'm thinking, why don't we say it like it is? Hamas needs to end this, and should have ended it on October the 8th, should have never started it on October the 7th. But now that they have, and now that they won't surrender, there is no choice but to make sure that, in the words of President Trump, as he has consistently said with great clarity, Hamas has no future, it has no business thinking it will ever be able to exist in Gaza again. And that not a few, but all of the hostages need to be released, and released immediately. This is what must happen. How Israel prosecutes the war is a decision exclusively for Israel to make. The U.S. is not going to dictate what that should be. And I know there are many opinions within Israel about that. But I don't think that there's confusion within the state of Israel that there has to be a clear victory over Hamas. For if they believe, rightly or wrongly, but if they believe that they have achieved even a modicum of victory, it only will invite more October 7ths and more hostages being taken, because they will know that even at great cost to their own people, for whom they have no respect, who they will put in the midst of harm's way intentionally, it's just the cost of doing business for them. If they have any semblance they have achieved some level of success, they will only repeat this over and over and over again. I was hoping America had learned its lesson after 9/11. I sometimes feel that we're so far removed from that date, and even though the moment of it, the impact of it is etched indelibly in our minds, I'm not sure that the understanding of why it happened and how it could happen again is as fresh as it needs to be. I can't imagine that anyone in Israel will ever forget October the 7th. But I hope in remembering it, it's remembered for what it was. It was not just an attack on your economy, not an attack on your educational system, not even an attack on your boundaries and borders. It was an attack on the civilized, morally based behavior upon which you are built. And even if they could take your land, and even if they could take every last penny that is possessed by any individual or business in this country, it would not satisfy the savages, the monsters who did what they did, because they're not interested in a coexistence. They're interested in you not having an existence. We never, ever can forget that. On 9/11, when the first airplane, which was American Flight 11, hit the North Tower at exactly 8:46 that morning, Eastern Time, the Port Authority of New York advised the people in the South Tower to stay at their desk and just to sit tight. The director of security for Morgan Stanley, which was located in the South Tower, would have none of that. The director of the security for Morgan Stanley was a gentleman by the name of Rick Rescorla, a Vietnam War veteran, who now directed the security for the 2,700 employees of Morgan Stanley. And he told them, we're going to evacuate. He grabbed a bullhorn, a walkie-talkie, and a cell phone, and he began leading 2,700 staff members of Morgan Stanley down the staircases and out the building to evacuate them. To keep them calm, he sang some songs from his childhood, old Cornish songs, just to keep the spirit as bright as he could. He escorted 2,700 of those employees down to the exits and out the building. And then, as we all know what happened, the plane then hit the South Tower, where they were and would have been had Rick Rescorla followed the advice of the Port Authority and left them at their desk. Rick Rescorla, after he got all 2,700 people out of the South Tower, was last seen going back into the building and up the staircase to see if there were any stragglers that he needed to get and help escort them out of that building. He was never seen again. He gave his life looking for the last of those for whom he was responsible. A true, absolute hero of the day. 2,700 people went to their families that evening that would not have, apart from the fact that Rick Rescorla gave his own life to protect them. I don't know what has happened to those 2,700 people, how many children they had, how many grandchildren they have had, what careers they have enjoyed since then. But I know this, that whatever they experienced in the 24 years since 9/11, they would not have experienced it had Rick Rescorla not understood that that first airplane was not the last mark of terrorism they would see. I hope that the result of this conference, the result of even the Institute itself, is a clear understanding that just as 9/11 was not the last attack that America will see, that October 7th is not the last attack that Israel will see. Israel is in a very precarious position because of its location and because there are so many people who are lined up around the planet to blame you, to accuse you, and for that matter, to annihilate you. One thing Americans learned after 9/11 was that we got to the point where we didn't care whether other nations of the world liked us. What we cared about was surviving and thriving again. And despite all of the pressure that you may be feeling and facing, whether it's from the Europeans who ought to be on your side, or whether it's from entities around the world or university campuses around the world who wave ridiculous flags without having a clue what they're waving, who give chants without having a semblance of an idea what river and what sea they are hoping will be free. I hope that Israel never forgets that the job that you have as a nation is that we have in the United States. It is not to live our lives so that people like us. It is not to live our lives so that people are considerate of us or they agree with us. It is to live our lives so that we have a life to live and we're willing to fight our enemies to the death to preserve our families, our children, our futures, and our future. That's what we must fight for. Thank you, and God bless you all.